Welcome to this month's Creation Justice webinar, a gathering place for building a faith-rooted and faith-sustained movement addressing some of the most pressing issues our world faces today. I'm Brooks Barrett, the Environmental Justice Minister for the United Church of Christ. I am joined by my esteemed co-host, the Reverend Michael Malcolm, the Executive Director for the People's Justice Council and Alabama Interfaith Power and Light. Michael, I'd love to get your thoughts on today's webinar. We pulled together a terrific group of people today for the webinar, and we also had a great planning team behind the webinar. Some of those people include the Reverend Jim Antal and Donna Bollinger, who heads the UCC's United Nations work. And so we've come up with this outstanding lineup to address greenwashing. As we get started, I am reminded of a passage that the Jesuit ethicist William O'Neill had. There is a play in which a cardinal admonishes the Catholic philosopher and author Sir Thomas More, and he says, "You're a constant regret to me, Thomas. If you could just see the facts flat on without that horrible moral squint, with just a little common sense, you could have been a statesman." And so to see and name greenwashing at the UN climate gathering requires a moral squint that not everyone might appreciate. What are your thoughts as we get started today?
Yeah, Brooks. It's right there. It's that squint that we're called into. It's that place of that squint, that moral squint, where we're called to see through it and to speak from it. We must report the things that we see. Today, more than ever, we need to make sure that we are reporting the things that we see. Beloveds, we are faced with chaos and disinformation coming from everywhere. Society favors feelings over facts, and it is moved by celebrity over science. But yet we are those who are called to see from, and to speak from that squint. And those who speak and those who see from that squint, they aren't moved by society. They aren't moved by what society does. They aren't moved by what society favors, but we are moved by what is moral, what is right, what is just. I'm grateful for the voices that will speak on this call. I look forward to the tools that will be provided to us that help us to articulate that which we see through this squint. Thank you.
As always, Michael, thank you for that beautiful framing as we get grounded and centered for this webinar. I'll now introduce the panelists in the order in which they'll be speaking. Up first, we'll have Cansin Leylim, who is the Associate Director of Global Campaigns at 350.org. Cansin leads 350.org's COP work every year, including running campaigns and strategy related to global climate policy. She has a senior dog and a senior cat that she has trouble leaving behind every year to attend COP. Our next speaker agreed to serve as a last-minute substitute for us when the Reverend Glenn Colonel from the Native American Comprehensive Plan came down sick. Reverend Marie Valjakka is a Sami pastor who works currently as a project coordinator concerning the truth and reconciliation process of the Sami people in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Finland. She has additionally served as the moderator for the World Council of Churches Ecumenical Indigenous Peoples Network. Up next, we'll then have Matthew Illian, who serves as the Director of Responsible Investing for United Church Funds. I can personally attest to how much I have valued Matthew's work. This past year, he guided the United Church Funds task force in developing a beautiful climate justice statement. And then finally, we will have Fletcher Harper, who is the Executive Director of GreenFaith, an international grassroots multi-faith climate justice organization He is the author of GreenFaith, Mobilizing God's People to Save the Earth. He is an obsessive ice hockey fan. We'll maybe delve into the geopolitical ramifications of that later on today. But we are delighted to have all of you with us today. Johnson, if you could get us started.
Yes, hi. Thank you to UCC for inviting me and the Reverends for having me among them. I want to start by pointing us to the exorbitant profits that were just announced by the fossil fuel companies like Total Energies, Chevron, Equinor, and ExxonMobil just last week, and more are coming from BP and Shell. So that is to say, fossil fuel industry is thriving, while the rest of the world is having to choose between eating and heating. So then it's no surprise that these same industries have poured millions into influencing our decision makers whilst pushing false fixes that continue the same exploitation and extraction of people and planet and take finances, time, and energy away from real, just solutions. It is again not news that fossil fuels caused the climate crisis. Climate crisis is addressed or supposed to be addressed on the highest level at UN's Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, Conference of Parties, COPs. It is the space where all countries have a vote and come together every year to make decisions on climate action. This year's COP28, and there's been 30 years of these talks, that is true, will take place in Dubai, United Arab Emirates, in about 3 weeks. The president-designate of COP28 is Sultan Al Jaber of UAE. He has served as the UAE's climate envoy and is the chairman of Masdar, a government-owned renewable energy company. But the interesting bit about him is he's also the chief executive officer of ADNOC, Abu Dhabi National Oil Corporation. Under Al Jaber, ADNOC is set to boost oil and gas production, which is something the International Energy Agency and climate scientists agree could cause the world to blow past limits of global heating. Actually, just today, a report was released by UN Environment Program titled The Production Gap. And the report found the production plans of the top 20 producing countries, including the United States, China, Australia, and the COP28 host, United Arab Emirates, are heading in the opposite direction of reaching net zero by 2050. ADNOC plans to boost oil production capacity by 2027 as a part of a $150 billion investment plan. If this sounds really weird to have the climate talks led by a fossil fuel CEO, let us first look at the history of UNFCCC COPs. Don't worry, I won't take you back to 1990s. So let's just look at last year. In Egypt, at COP27, the fossil fuel lobbyists' numbers were 25% more than the previous year and reached a total of 636 delegates. What does that number mean? To put it into context, that was bigger than any national delegation of an African country. Or let's put it this way, it was more than the collective total of delegates from Puerto Rico, Myanmar, Haiti, Philippines, Mozambique, the Bahamas, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Thailand, and Nepal. Why did I cite these 10 countries? Because these are the 10 countries most impacted by climate change, according to a climate change index. The year before that, in 2021 Glasgow, COP27 saw over 500 fossil fuel lobbyists. So that is to say, if the fossil fuel industry was a country, it would have the biggest delegation at COPs every year on a continuous basis. So the fact that the COP28 president-designate is also the CEO of a fossil fuel company with plans to expand its capacity for production, and that he plans to give the fossil fuel industry a seat at the climate talks should not come as a surprise to anyone at this point. As long as there is no conflict of interest policy at the UNFCCC, this can go on. In his interview published in The Guardian, Sultan Al Jaber claimed that he is there to promote inclusivity for COP28, that he wants everyone to be heard, and that the best feedback and advice he got was the uncensored feedback that he received from NGOs and civil society. So in the spirit of being clear and concise and continuing to give that feedback from the civil society and grassroots movements that follow science, we keep repeating, we need to phase out all fossil fuels without relying on dangerous distractions like carbon capture and storage, including vested interests in this process as if they would be okay with ending their profits and business as usual just takes away our precious time. The core conflict of interest arises from the fact that fossil fuel companies profit from the continued extraction and burning of fossil fuels, which directly contribute to climate change. As a result, they have a vested interest in obstructing or diluting policies that would reduce their emissions. Having the fossil fuel industry be stakeholders in the climate talks where we're supposed to take action to stop global heating makes no sense, let alone those talks being presided over by the fossil fuel industry. It's basically like a tobacco CEO getting tobacco companies together to promise to solve lung cancer by putting up no smoking signs on the walls of their cigarette-making companies and factories. Following that example, the UNFCCC could look to the World Health Organization's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control for inspiration on how to address the conflict and protect public interest policymaking from vested interests. Tobacco industry is not allowed in that space. So why is the fossil fuel industry not only allowed at UNFCCC COPs, but wielding immense power over them, being able to affect outcomes? So then UNFCCC should, one, adopt an appropriate definition of conflict of interest and a rigorous conflict of interest framework that prevents entities with private interests from unduly influencing or undermining national or international climate policy. And two, strengthen the procedures for admission of observers within the UNFCCC and its instruments. And this goes without saying, governments should stop fossil fuel production and stop citing dangerous distractions as if they are solutions and head us towards what scientists say is manageable limits of global heating. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that terrific opening orientation for us. We'll now turn things over to Marie.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. I've heard that in Japan they have this saying that if you want to catch a fish, plant a tree. And for my ears, that sounds very sustainable way of living. Basically, it means that if you take something, you have to give something. So these days we would like to say that, okay, if you spend something, you need to compensate. And when I think the location for the next COP meeting, Dubai, I can only think oil, luxury, artificial islands, huge tall buildings, and money to spend. One can only think that, okay, maybe there's also money for compensation. Because honestly, let's face the fact, if you want to compensate, you need to have money. Compensating is a bit tricky after all. I don't live in Japan. I live in Finland, in Finnish side of Sami homeland area, so-called Sapmi. And my home is 300 kilometers to north from the Arctic Circle line. So very, very up north. We do have a very beautiful nature here, but you need to remember that when going to the Arctic area, the nature is also very, very sensitive, and especially very sensitive to climate change, which we are, by the way, facing on a front line here in the Arctic area. Some of the researchers says that the Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the rest of the world. So from my context, I would like to say that before you do anything, please try to plant a tree and look how slowly it grows, or if it even survives at all. And you'll see that compensating is not always easy. Can everything even be compensated? And are we able to compensate fast enough? Is compensating just an easy way out of feeling guilt if you're spending too much of these resources of this planet? Is it just a privilege that is not even accessible for all? Perhaps we know the answer for these questions already here in the Nordic countries and with the Sami people, because we have this saying that really guides our relationship with the nature. And it goes like this: you shall not take more than is needed. And the other saying we have is that do not fish the same lake every day. Mother Earth is not something that we can compensate. And I believe that the protecting of the creation is very central to the mission of the church. We humans are called to protect creation. Genesis 2:15 says that God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to work it and take care of it. When it comes to our homelands, we are also called to work it and take care of it. These days, Sami people, we are witnessing various interests to use natural resources that are located in our homeland area. We think that development in the Arctic area must be sustainable in ways that doesn't threaten the environment or the traditional life that Sami people have lived for centuries. What we are facing right now is so-called green colonialism. We've been talking about the fossil fuels, and maybe this green colonialism is a very big topic also. I was participating in COP26 in Glasgow 2 years ago. And there, in a side event, I told about this green colonialism that we are facing here in the Sami homeland area. I told about how the Supreme Court of Norway had just ruled that these enormous windmill parks are actually violating the rights of indigenous peoples here in the Sami homeland area. And Sami people, we thought that finally we've received justice. This kind of decisions could lead us to build climate justice, where justice of indigenous peoples are also taken into account. But then something happened, and now 2 years later, we've realized that we are still in the same situation. Windmills are still there, running and making wind power. And it's green power, so what's the big deal? And don't get me wrong, we need to reach the green transition. But this way is not the right one, because now it is affecting to the life of indigenous peoples and traditional livelihoods they've been practicing for decades, appreciating the surrounding nature, surrounding waters and lands. For me, this so-called Fosen case in Norway is threatening because I realized that if this can happen in Norway, this can happen and will happen and is already happening around the globe in those areas where the other indigenous brothers and sisters are living and practicing their traditional livelihoods. And by the way, fun fact, as much as 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity lies within indigenous peoples' territories. And I think it's not a coincidence. We have a long history living in a close connection to the land, even though biodiversity can be rich in the areas where indigenous peoples lives by working it and taking care of it. Very often indigenous peoples live in poor conditions if we measure poverty and wealth by Western standards. Our homelands are usually seen as a good resources, and this is why biodiversity and indigenous peoples are easily threatened and abused with those who have power. Now in the green transition, our homelands are seen as a good places for the green power. We're seeing the urge for the green energy, but often we forget the indigenous peoples living and practicing traditional livelihoods in their homelands, working it and taking care of it. We need to fight for climate justice, but not without fighting for justice for indigenous peoples. As followers of Christ, we are called to fight against injustice. In this context, that means reminding decision makers of their responsibility to ensure that vulnerable groups are not subjected to greater struggles when compensating or when transiting to the green energy. However, we desperately need more sustainable solutions because in the Arctic, the ice is melting, in the Pacific, the sea levels are rising. Indigenous brothers and sisters from Arctic to Amazons to Asia and to Pacific, we are all facing these impacts. I know that we have wisdom in Indigenous communities about how to live in connection with the creation, with our Mother Earth, by working it and taking care of it. But are we really ready to listen to that wisdom? Are we ready to invite Indigenous peoples to those decision-making tables? Or do we just think that we can compensate everything later? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marie, for those words and that presentation. We'll now transition to Matthew Illian. And Matthew, I'm just realizing my eyes skipped over in making the introductions what I should have mentioned, which is we're really grateful to be partnering with United Church Funds on this webinar. United Church Funds is co-sponsoring this webinar, and we are delighted to have you with us. So take things away, Matthew.
Wow, Brooks, thanks so much for having me and us as a participant here, and to Marie for sharing your thoughts from your heart. Brooks, you mentioned our climate justice statement when you were doing the first introduction, and I'm really proud of that, particularly following Marie, because in that we committed to engaging with, amplifying, and including frontline voices from BIPOC and low-income communities unequally burdened by the climate crisis. And I should start out by saying we represent, we're investors. And so we invest on behalf of 1,000+ churches and other faith-based organizations. And when it comes to the climate work, we're trying to do a better job of centering that work around those who are most impacted. I should also say, as investors, we see climate risk as, climate justice as a faith value, as well as a business risk. And by that, what I mean is that businesses today are facing higher standards than the old days when they could treat rivers and lakes like, corporate refuse piles of the air, etc. So we're starting to see states, countries, localities putting new, laws in place. We're seeing the Biden administration really focus on environmental justice. We're seeing the UCC Public Policy Office advocating for environmental justice for all policies, and the business community, as much as they may be dragging their feet, they see this happening. And when I say the business community is dragging their feet, I do think a little bit about my kids. We've got high school, middle, elementary. We've covered the whole spectrum. We have 4 kids. And sometimes when you ask them to clean up their room, most of the time, actually, you get that look like, really? And you've got to look back like, no, really, like, I do want you to clean up your room. And then often, you'll get that slow, rise off the couch. And I see some of those same things play out in the corporate world. Whereas, I think the corporate world understands that society is not tolerating, that they need to clean things up, and yet there's some feet dragging going on. And don't get me wrong, I love my kids, they do eventually clean things up, but there is some collective pressure that needs to be put on, and accountability on the business community. So I wanted to share a little bit about how we're approaching that from an investor perspective, and share with you some of the tools that we have as investors. So I'm going to share actually some slides here, and let's see if I can get this. So one of the tools that we have is voting our for the board of directors at these companies. And one of the reports that was done recently is on how the largest asset managers in the world vote their vote for directors and vote for shareholder resolutions. And this particular report was done by a great group called Majority Action. They're doing some really important work in climate and racial justice, from the asset manager and the finance sector. And in this report called Climate in the Boardroom, they looked at how many times did these large asset managers support the entire board of directors at companies that have been deemed by scientists and by responsible investors as misaligned, meaning they're not even really making a good, honest effort to come up with a net zero transition plan. They're not sharing transition targets. So there were 17 corporations that were viewed as like the most misaligned. And the question was, okay, as these large asset managers, they get to vote on the directors. How are they voting? Well, you can see Fidelity at 17 corporations, all 100% of the board of directors was supported all 17 times. At Vanguard, we have the same thing, that another one of the largest asset managers in the world, 17 boards of directors, and they're about 10 to 12 usually on a board of directors. So we're talking about 10 to 12 votes at each of these companies. 100% of all 10 to 12 were supported by Fidelity and Vanguard 100% of the time. BlackRock and State Street, we saw a little bit of nuance, meaning there might have been one director on the board that they voted against for some reason, but still very strong support. And what we're seeing here is that the powers that be in the financial world are really not holding the boards of directors accountable. They couldn't find, even one reason, whether it would be a climate issue, whether it be excessive pay, all the things that are going to vote against some of these boards of directors. A few years ago, we did have a vote against directors at Exxon, and there were 3 establishment, board recommended director votes that didn't get approved. They didn't get a majority. And did that make huge news in terms of, that really never happens. I do show that, in all 17 cases, we voted against at least one, if not 4 or 5 on the board of directors. And I don't say that to lift up United Church Funds per se, because there are a large number of our colleagues, dozens of them, that are looking at these boards and holding them accountable in the board votes. And what we haven't seen yet is that trickle up to the largest asset managers. We are working with our colleagues at the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility to hold these large asset managers accountable. We're having meetings with them, and we are filing shareholder resolutions to let them know that, blindly or blanketly supporting the board of directors at these companies that are strategically important in terms of carbon emissions, environmental justice, it needs to change. And we need some pushback. So I wanted to share that, the votes that we have as investors is important. And for you as whether you have a retirement plan, whether you invest, through your church, etc., how your funds are being voted is important as well. I also want to share a bit, and this follows on the back of what Marie was sharing on Indigenous voices, listening to those on the front lines. There is an effort that we are a part of among a growing number of investors to empower Indigenous communities with the development that's happening all around, particularly in the energy transition. And Marie mentioned, wind, solar. A lot of the battery components that are needed, minerals that are needed, are coming from Indigenous territories. And one of the principles that we are seeing and that we are supporting in development, in finance, is this concept of free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC. This essentially means that those communities should not be asked after all of the approvals have been made for a new pipeline, for their consent or support, but that they should be engaged before the planning, process even gets started in how those sacred lands, how the territorial rights will be used. And so we are specifically working with an engagement in the big, large U.S. asset managers. Last year, we engaged with Citibank, and we are again this year, and we're also adding J.P. Morgan to that. And one of the neat things that we've seen in our community that we've been able to do is empower Indigenous voices in the boardrooms. And so you see a picture of a boardroom meeting where this concept of FPIC is being brought up to the entire board by a member of an Indigenous community. And it's something that, we want to see embedded in how underwriting is happening. And, we've seen some progress where FPIC is starting to be recognized in the underwriting process, who gets loans or financing, who doesn't, who gets insurance and who doesn't. But we'd like to see it more robustly implemented. I want to turn now and just talk about the insurance industry. There is a great report that came out of Ceres and also the state of California. It's called Climate Risk Management in the U.S. Insurance Sector. A few quick facts. According to the nonprofit climate researcher, Climate Central, the time between billion-dollar disasters in the U.S. in the last 5 years, so this is from 2017 to 2021, was just 18 days on average between a billion-dollar disaster. If you go back to the 1980s, and this is inflation adjusted, so not a billion, let's just say it's $500 million inflation adjusted, it was 82 days. So we're seeing more and more these climate disasters, billion-dollar expenses coming up more regularly. And we're also seeing that more and more, these climate disasters are falling most heavily on low and moderate income communities whose lives are being impacted by flooding, by fires. In this report, they look at what the insurance industry is doing to consider and adapt their policies to climate change. And they find that less than 40% of insurers are disclosing critical measures or targets on climate change. So while you see big insurers like AIG say, hey, we are focused on net zero by 2050, the reality is there aren't any targets or metrics behind that. And so we're working with responsible investors to demand that they come up with credible climate transition plans. Climate transition plans that are just, climate transition plans that consider listening to local stakeholder voices. Only 20% of those insurers that were analyzed had done scenario analysis to even look at, what's going to happen to their insurance pools if temperature rises, not the 1.5 degrees that we're hoping we can contain it to, but the 2.5, 3 degrees Celsius. So this is work that can't be done alone. This is work that we are endeavoring to do with partners, and not just the investors. This must also be done with policymakers, and most importantly, the public needs to be behind this, because essentially the political will only be there as our neighbors, as our communities are behind this transition, that it be just, that it be deliberate. And the last thing I just wanted to share, this is our Beyond Fossil Fuels Fund, and we have many churches invest in this fund. And I'm just sharing this. If you look over the 3 years, the average return has been 16.5% versus 14.44. I'm not saying this to toot our own horn, just say you can invest in a fossil fuel conscious, responsible way and still generate, you can still generate returns. This isn't an either. There are times to make, you have to, as Marie said, give something up. But there are also ways that you can invest responsibly and in a future that we all believe is one that we can be excited about. And with that, Brooks, I'm going to turn it back over to you and stop sharing my screen.
Thank you, Matthew, for that presentation. And now we turn to our final panelist for today, Fletcher Harper.
Hey, thanks, Brooke. And great to see you. Great to see Michael. Good to be with everybody. So building on what Matthew was just talking about, I'm going to talk about sort of the theme of greenwashing and the need for action in the finance sector. And again, building on what Matthew just said, the problem with the finance sector is that it is continuing to invest at massive levels in new fossil fuel and deforestation projects, while at the same time greenwashing actively to the contrary. And just the most recent Banking on Climate Chaos report showed that in the 7 years since the Paris Agreement, the world's 60 largest banks have plowed over $5.5 trillion into new fossil fuel projects. Government subsidies for fossil fuels are at the 7 trillion mark as of 2022. And there's clear data, and this is from the International Monetary Fund, saying that you eliminate these subsidies and immediately you prevent 1.6 million premature deaths. You raise government revenues by 4.4 trillion, and you put global emissions on track towards reaching the global warming target levels. So the behavior of the sector is appalling. The pathway forward is clear, not easy. Things got worse with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. At the Glasgow COP, a large number of large asset managers, including several of the ones that Matthew mentioned, had gotten an enormous amount of publicity in the midst of a COP that was otherwise, frankly, thoroughly unnotable. And they had gotten publicity because these major asset managers said, we're going to phase down our fossil fuel investments and ensure that all of our investment portfolios are net zero by 2050. That was a shaky commitment to start with, because the net zero terminology leaves an enormous amount of wiggle room. But to make things worse, once Russia invaded Ukraine and the price of fossil fuels spiked, this same group of investors issued a statement which got far less media attention, saying that because the price and value of fossil fuels had increased so much, and ostensibly because the world needed more energy security, they were ditching their pledge to be carbon neutral to have their portfolios be carbon neutral by 2050. So the behavior is just surreally bad. And we think that a critical piece of the picture is to have faith groups publicly and directly involved in pressuring these institutions hard to change and working to threaten the integrity of their brand, because history shows that that is at times the most effective tactic to get them to change. Most recently, just 2 weeks ago at a major retirement planning asset manager conference in San Diego, two clergy, one an interfaith minister and one a Unitarian Universalist, peacefully disrupted a panel on which a high-level executive from the asset manager Vanguard was speaking, calling on Vanguard, which is currently, again, one of the world's largest investors in fossil fuels, to stop, because that's what's necessary. These kinds of actions are uncomfortable. They're not easy. It takes an enormous amount of courage for people to take part in these, but history is really clear that without this kind of action, sustained and at a meaningful scale, large-scale social change simply doesn't happen. Connected with and inspired out of this, we've had meetings with about 24 different religious networks and organizations over the past 4 months, from Hindu, Buddhist, Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Unitarian, and interspiritual, interfaith communities. And the idea has emerged for a new campaign, which will be formally announced early in January. The campaign will target banks and asset managers with a simple demand. They must phase out their funding and financing for fossil fuel projects by 2030. They need to be showing real progress, measurable progress towards that before then. And if they do not meet that deadline, the campaign will be creating a platform on which individuals of different religious and spiritual backgrounds, as well as religious and spiritual institutions, will pledge to withdraw their funds if that demand is not met. This is 7 years in the future, and a lot of people say, oh, well, we need action nearer than 7 years. We agree. We will start withdrawing our funds. Well, we already have withdrawn our funds from a bank that's actively investing from banks that are actively investing in fossil fuels, and put it in a bank that is not. But the reason for that rationale is severalfold. It's absolutely fine if individuals or institutions want to move their money right away. We're developing the means to provide guidance and a community of practice that can help make that happen. Other religious institutions, we know by experience, will not be able or willing to move quickly on this. 7 years is an adequate time for planning to be in place around a set of demands that clearly are necessary to meet what the planet needs. The final thing is that actually what we want more than anything else is for people of faith consistently to make it clear to the finance sector and to the wider public that the practices of these institutions are destroying the planet and creating conditions that are creating untold suffering for billions of people, and that is utterly unacceptable. We have 11 organizations to date that have signed on that are going to be publicly announcing this campaign together. We're going to maintain the suspense and let people know, make that announcement in January. We have religious institutions from continental Europe, from the UK, and from the United States to date. The plan will be to have this campaign invite people of faith and religious institutions to make that pledge. We'll have periodic announcements and celebrations of the organizations that have taken the pledge. We will also have periodic days of action. The next one will be coming up in early May of 2024, where we will carry out direct actions, nonviolent direct actions of various kinds at financial institutions. The last thing I'll say before closing is that there will be people, understandably, who will say there are currently, at least in the United States, no major financial institutions that exist that would meet these demands. And that, sadly, is true. But the reality is, when the fossil fuel divestment movement got started, there were no fossil fuel-free investment vehicles on the face of the earth either. And the rapid growth of that movement created a demand which organizations such as United Church Funds have met with an array of successful, effective, professionally managed products. So the possibility is there. We would like to invite local congregations, regional associations of religious groups, national and international faith-based bodies to be part of this. And if you'd like to know more, you can contact me at fletcher@greenfaith.org, and I'll put that in the chat. So many thanks.
Thank you so much, Fletcher, for that inspiring presentation. Michael, do you have a question to get us started as we do some Q&A?
Yeah, I guess I'm gonna cut to the chase, Brooks. Before we talked about that squint, and we talked about being able to see things for what they are and call them out. But I also not only want to call it out, but be able to take action to be, if you will, alternative or a counter to what we're seeing with greenwashing. How do we as communities of faith become that counter narrative for this greenwashing that's taking place right now? And I guess I can open that up to any one of you all or all of you all to give us some practical ways of addressing the issues of greenwashing in this climate space.
I mean, I really briefly, I think it's very important that religious leaders call it out from the pulpit, and there are plenty of examples, sadly. I mean, ExxonMobil carried out a multi-year advertising campaign about about all the energy from green algae that they were planning to get. And they dropped the campaign, and researchers showed through an excellent group called Influence Map that they spent more on the ad campaign than they spent on the research. So I think it's really important for religious leaders to put this information out there and to deal with any pushback from their congregations. But these are bold-faced, intentional lies.
Yeah, I'll just in some ways fine-tune Michael's questions a little bit and maybe look to you, Johnson. I really was inspired by some of the things that you said about, attending, that there's a kind of a model for getting rid of these conflicts of interest. And I'm curious, for many, I think the United Nations can seem like this distant entity over which we don't have much say or power. How do we kind of get from where we are in this conversation to taking action that can move forward those kind of ideas that you're presenting?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for that. So first thing I would say is there is actually existing campaigns around one, making polluters pay, and two, kicking polluters out. And especially big polluters, and in the climate justice sphere, these are the fossil fuel companies and their backers, financial backers as well. That would be basically joining the campaigns. Kick big polluters out is going to show up in a big way at COP28 as well. We are going to be restricted. We're going to be restrained in terms of being able to hold actions as we would usually do out on the streets at the COP space. But these are going to happen. And as we call on kicking big polluters out from these spaces that is supposed to uphold our interests as the public, then both congregations and public citizenry everywhere can actually take action as well. Demand from their governments that this is not accepted, that this is not the way to go, that their interests are should be upheld at these spaces, and these vested interests of profits should not actually have a stance in the table. For instance, John Kerry from the US, to talk to our audience, maybe I'm based in Turkey, but so I can't speak to that government, but basically talking to like John Kerry, saying Sultan Al Jaber was actually a great choice because fossil fuel industry should also have a seat at the table, was mind-blowing. but also maybe not that surprising, looking at the historic way that these things have been handled between governments and the politicians, funders as well, in terms of these vested interests.
I guess looking at interest and self-interest, Matthew, I'll lean your way with divestment. I see divestment as a counter narrative to what we're seeing with greenwashing. I know with the UCC that we're all autonomous, so each individual congregation makes up their own mind on how they invest. Can you speak more about how disinvestment could be a tool that we could use to, if you will, boycott this greenwashing that's happening right now?
Well, I mean, absolutely. So much of, I think, what's needed is on the consumer or demand side, or you could call it the investor side, because the reality is if you're not engaged and you're just investing in, let's say, an index fund, broadly diversified, you're owning all these companies. I mean, you're owning a little bit of everything. And fundamentally, you're saying, I support business as usual. And that's going to get us business as usual. And that's what these big asset managers and banks are saying is, hey, there's still demand for this stuff. And so I do think to your point, we need to get more engaged with the choices that we make as individuals, as institutions. And I think, for some people that means divesting from fossil fuels. I think for others, maybe it's, it's, hey, working to kind of emphasize those organizations, businesses that seem to be coming up with solutions. So I don't want to say there's a one size fits all, Reverend Michael, because it's never that way. You and I know it's never that way, and we need to be working. I think we need to be divesting, and we need some inside game. And you can't be working on the inside if you don't have a seat at the table. So I see a place for both.
Thank you, Matthew, for that response. I'm going to turn to kind of the last question to Marie, who I want to make sure we hear from before we have to wrap things up, unfortunately. Marie, I'm thinking about something that I read over the summer by someone named Grant Gutierrez, and he gave a warning about greenwashing developing a justice flavor, an environmental justice flavor, and justice and equality and equity words are getting thrown around a lot today. But what he kind of was pointing towards is that, we have to be kind of vigilant about what we mean by justice and what it's meaning in practice for us. It can't just be kind of tinkering with processes. It has to be at the level of outcomes and solutions. I'm saying all of that as sort of a precursor to asking you, coming out of your faith tradition and your perspective, and working on these issues and addressing things like green colonialism, so forth. What does justice mean for you? How should we be thinking about justice in a rigorous sense here as people of faith?
Well, justice for me means that Indigenous peoples have a safe place in the decision-making tables in our societies. And we need to invite also other marginalized groups to these tables, and to make sure that there will be this FPIC. And it's surprisingly that our countries, for example, we're going through the truth and reconciliation processes and things like that. But at the same time, when I'm talking about FPIC, everybody's like, okay, this is the first time I'm hearing about it. So it's not really, that well implemented to our societies. And it gives a strong message that we still have a lot of work to do with these issues and to really, reach the justice. But for me, the justice is that our voices would be heard, and also that heard with that kind of a appreciation that we're not just consulted because we want to, tick the box, but we would really be there in the decision-making processes and we should really change the whole mindset to more like a bottom-up kind of decision-making processes.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. As always, all these good things must come to an end, sadly but surely. We will, as always, transition in a moment to hearing from Thaddeus Elliott, who, for those who want to stick around, we love to have you stick around as Thaddeus gives us updates on what's going on in Congress and DC. But but Michael, before we wrap things up and send off our panelists with some applause, any final thoughts, Michael?
Thank you all, panelists, for being with us. Thank you to the audience for listening in. We have given you all, they have given you all, rather, different tools that we could use to impact and take lead in this fight for our better tomorrow. I ask that you would take advantage of it and continue to be engaged in this fight. And continue to lead through that squint. Thank you.
Thank you again to all of our panelists. Each viewer is terrific, and I know for sure I will appreciate kind of rewinding this on YouTube to listen to it again and fully absorb your wisdom and your comments and your insights. So thank you very sincerely for being with us today.